Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition.
It's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for our online service. Wherever and whenever you are watching, we are thankful for you and that you are a part of our community today. Welcome. Briefly, I want to let you know something fun that our Kids Point families are inviting you to. Crosspointe Kids Point Ministry is hosting a color run on May 23rd at the church campus, and this is for all kids and families. You're invited to attend, and you can find out more at crosspointe.org/colorrun. If you want to know more about how to plug in at Crosspointe, if you want to know more about how to participate financially, you can go to our website, crosspointe.org/contribute, and find out multiple ways to contribute financially, online, through stocks, paper mail, etc. As you might know, at Easter, we did an initiative where we gave out $100 for those of you who wanted to participate, and you were to put that money back into places where you saw need in your immediate community. And you have come through. We're going to be able to share these stories with you in upcoming weeks, but we have had over 30 pages of stories, multiple stories per page, of just ways that you have reached out, created blessing bags for the homeless, helped individuals and teachers and organizations, tipped in big ways, so much more. But I want to share one story that stood out to me this week. This woman is a member of our community who lives in High Point, North Carolina. And this is what she said. She said, "I have volunteered with Reading Connections, an adult literacy program which serves native-born and immigrant populations for over 5 years. I currently have a class of 6 wonderful women from Burma, Myanmar, Pakistan, Mexico, and Sudan. Their stories make me cry. When COVID hit, I had to learn Zoom, I'm a geezer, if I wanted to continue volunteering. It was a blessing, as our 4+ weekly hours on Zoom has permitted us to really get to know each other through the ups and downs of the lockdown. They are an amazing group trying to learn English well so they can pursue their future plans. These women have 12 children between them, many of them preschool and school age. They live in small apartments and are on tight budgets, but love veggies. So I wanted to bless them in ways that could involve the kids. I shopped for economical, pot-friendly veggie plants, patio and Sweet 100 tomatoes, greens, and herbs. I had some extra super large pots and bought some other large pots along with Miracle-Gro for repotting. Believe it or not, the money goes quickly. I typed how to grow veggies in pots slides and used them for a lesson in our Reading Connections class." So this person went on to say that after that she created slides about how to grow the plants, and she also delivered the plants to the people in her class. And I thought it was such an incredible way to reach out to the community and such a gift. So thank you to all of you who are participating, and we have enjoyed reading your stories. Lastly, I want to extend to you all a happy Mother's Day. Thank you, moms, for all that you do, seen and unseen. We want to acknowledge you today and say thank you. I want to also acknowledge that this, we know, can be a difficult day. The word mother, for so many reasons, both positive and negative, never evokes just one emotion. It holds many emotions all at the same time. There are other sides to the Hallmark cards and the flowers and the breakfasts in bed. It's filled with mixed emotions, celebration and love and pain and awe and pride, but also regret and disappointment and fear and so much more. And we want to acknowledge those feelings today and tell you that whatever you're feeling, whatever this brings up in you, it's okay. And if you need someone to talk to about it, we have resources. Please get in touch with us. Our culture tells us a lot about what mothers are supposed to be like. Selfless, compassionate, unconditionally loving, long-suffering. These are characteristics that culture said good mothers have. And many of us recognize, either from just knowledge or personal experience, not all birth mothers choose to or are able to act in these ways. Because just because you're physically a mother doesn't mean you act like one. Even good moms on their best days don't always embody all of these characteristics. And I think that's because these characteristics don't describe the physical act of being a mother. They describe mother, the verb. They describe mothering. And they're also depictions of God as mother, the God who draws us in, who speaks in a still small voice, God who is known for patience and persistence and unconditional love, God who gives sacrificially, the God who helps mold us into people that better reflect God's own character, the God who recognizes the voice of her children. This is mothering God. Who we describe as mother may be someone who did not give us physical birth. Adopted moms, aunts, coaches, pastors, teachers, friends, mentors, we could make a long list. Because while the noun mother means to have physically brought another human being into the world, to have at one time housed another person inside of your body, the verb to mother or mothering is something completely different. It may be easy to recognize that we have at all been mothered at some point in our lives. We experience this not only from our biological moms sometimes, but also from others who claim that title and some who don't. It may be a little bit harder to recognize that we also often are active in mothering. If you've ever shown compassion to someone, if you've been patient or given grace, you have mothered. If you've ever sat in the darkness or the dirt with someone when there were a million other things you could have been doing, you've mothered. If you've ever cared for, protected, given selflessly, then you've mothered. If you've ever loved and corrected simultaneously, you've mothered. If you have nurtured another living thing, you've participated in mothering. And therefore, you have behaved in a God-like way. This isn't just an abstract idea. The Holy Spirit, the breath of God, ruach, is feminine. And the feminine mother God is spoken of in Jewish poetry as being intelligent, holy, subtle, clear, creator, invulnerable, loving the good, irresistible, steadfast, overseeing, more beautiful than the sun, as the breath and the power of God. And God is described as not only having given physical breath and life to humanity, like a physical mother does, but acting in a mothering way, as a mother hen gathering her chicks in protection and in care, as a mama bear fighting for those she loves. All of these are acts of mothering. Whenever we verb mother, whether we're male or female, whether we have had a child in our wombs or not, we are demonstrating and practicing the character and the spirit of God. We want to honor this today. Both physical and spiritual mothers who show us a broader and more complete picture of who God is and what it means to be more like her. Thank you.
Holy Ghost. Our hearts inspire, descend upon us from above, source of the old, prophetic fire, fountain of light, fountain of love. Come, Holy Ghost, by you we see the prophets wrote and spoke, and in you we will believe. Unlock the truth, yourself the key, unseal the sacred book, until Jesus we receive. Expand thy wings, celestial dove, brood over our souls tonight, replace it with your love on our trouble. Spirits move, and let there now be light, replace the lies with truth. Come, Holy Ghost, so Jesus we can know if you within us shine, if you within us flow, and we sing with all the saints below, the depths of love divine, that the world may know we are yours, we are yours, we are yours, we are yours.
I'm all at sea, where no one can bother me. Forgot my roots, if only for a day. Just me and my thoughts, sailing far away, like a warm drink it seeps into my soul. Please just leave me right here on my own. Later on you could spend some time with me if you want to. Oh, let's see. I'm all at sea, where no one can bother me. I sleep by myself, I drink on my own. I don't speak to nobody. I gave away my phone. Like a warm drink it seeps into my soul. Please just leave me right here on my own. Later on you could spend some time with me if you want to. Oh, let's see. Now I need you more than ever. I need you more than ever now. You don't need it every day, but sometimes don't you just crave to disappear within your mind? You never know what you might find. So come and spend some time with me, and we will spend it all at sea. Like a warm drink it seeps into my soul. Please just leave me right here on my own. Later on you could spend some time with me if you want to. Oh, let's see. If you want to, all I say. Oh.
About 5 months ago, Jeff Chu retweeted a video on his social media that caught my attention. And all he wrote on the tweet was OMG. And below what he wrote, there was this original caption for the video that someone else had written. And the caption went like this: "You're gonna watch this video about sloths and think you know how it ends, but you do not." And so that's your same warning. You're gonna think you know how this video I'm about to show you about sloths ends, but trust me, you don't.
So these guys have moved very slowly in the trees, but believe it or not, these guys can actually swim very well. So that's one of their that's one of the structures they use to protect themselves in the wild. So if a jaguar is chasing them and they happen to be over a river or lake or something like that, they will actually just fall out of the tree into the water. And they can swim really fast, and they can actually hold their breath for up to 22 minutes. So once again, that slow metabolism can kind of come in handy when you're trying to get away from a jaguar.
22 minutes.
Yes.
Wow. Well, that's awesome. We were talking beforehand, yes, the sloth, this one is fast for a sloth, but he's still slow. Why? Because sloths, by definition, are slow. That's how they are made to operate. And it shouldn't surprise us that they move slowly. And in today's lessons, we see something that should not surprise us as well, and that is Christians are persecuted. Sloths move slow, well, Christians are persecuted. That kind of happens because of who we are.
I mean, how in the world does he make that leap? From sloths are slow, obviously Christians are persecuted. I mean, I tell you all the time, there's some weird stuff out there, but there's some really weird stuff out there. Now, for the past couple weeks, we've been in a series that we're calling 9 Monsters. And when we tend to think of monsters, we tend to default to this idea of creatures that need to be slayed or destroyed because, frankly, we think they're out to destroy us. But the word monster actually has its roots in a couple Latin words, which mean to show a warning. Where the original idea was that a monster would serve as an alert or a signal to warn us that we have forgotten something important that was true. It's kind of like a light that shows up on the dashboard of your car that's supposed to alert you, hey, you know what? You need to pay attention to this. So instead of feeling all sorts of shame about these monsters that show up in our lives that we just can't ever seem to defeat, what if we welcomed them as simply the helpful alerts that they're intended to be? So that's what we're trying to do with this series. So probably not surprisingly, today I want to talk about sloth. But here's the thing. Many of you probably assume that you think or can guess where you know this is going, but more than likely you don't. So I just want you to hang in there with me, because maybe you think you know, but you probably don't. Because listen, this isn't about coming after laziness. This isn't about shame or guilt or beating anyone up or giving you fuel to go and try to give your teenager or another loved one a swift kick in the pants to get them off the couch and get them moving. This isn't about that. This is about paying attention to an alert that can show up in all of our lives in some way. And sure, some of us are more wired this way than others. But the reality is it can show up in all of us. And the challenge becomes wrestling with what is the helpful thing it can alert us toward. And so that's what I want us to do today. That's the work I want us to do. Now, when we look at the wisdom we find in the scriptures, the word ancient writers tended to associate with sloth was the word sluggard, where we read passages like this in the book of Proverbs. Sluggards do not plow in season, so at harvest time they look but find nothing. Or here's another. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. Now again, I get it. It's really easy to hear those word pictures and simply see them as a condemnation of laziness, with the solution to that being, you know what? Just quit being lazy. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get moving and get to work and be responsible. Just quit being so lazy. And that's often the message that we hear. And it's also the message many of us burden others with. But here's a couple things I think that are critical that we point out up front. When these wisdom sayings that we find in the Bible were written, they were written about 2,500 years ago. And these ancient writers had no idea about the concept of clinical depression. They had no idea about chemicals misfiring in the brain or how any of that works. We talk about this a lot, but if you're new with our community, you need to know that we all know around here, depression is a very real thing. Trauma is a very real thing. But for some reason, our culture is very comfortable with seeing a trained medical professional or taking medication when something inside our stomach or our kidneys or our muscles gets injured or starts acting in some abnormal way. But suddenly that same culture wants to attach a certain stigma to people if things misfire in the brain or our thoughts or emotions get affected by some kind of trauma and therapy is needed or medication is needed. And unfortunately, we can then attach that same stigma to ourselves. And so just let me be clear. What we're talking about today isn't depression. I'm not talking about depression. Another thing this idea of sloth is it's not referring to rest or naps or playing and having fun and Sabbath and reflection and vacation, basically living with any sort of good and healthy rhythm in your life. Because sometimes when you hear people respond to a question like, hey, well, what did you do this weekend? And they say something like, yeah, you know what? I didn't really do much of anything. I took a nap, watched some Netflix. I mean, I probably shouldn't have been productive, but you know what? Yeah, we just weren't. And when we say things like that, there's this underlying sense that we feel guilty about it and that somehow we should apologize for it. And while there could be times when what we're really doing is practicing a type of avoidance, more often than not, it's simply us choosing to live in a good rhythm. I'm often reminded of this command from God in the Hebrew scriptures, where it says, 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and harvest, you must rest. Now, the reason I love that is because it's good to keep in mind that this was being spoken to an ancient people whose lives revolved around agriculture. And it was these very same people who were instructed, listen, I'm going to tell you about this rest thing, but even during plowing season and harvest, when it feels like you shouldn't take a break, when it feels like you can't spare a single moment, listen, even in those seasons, you must rest. If you want to live well, it must include rest. And so as we get into this idea of sloth, again, we're not talking about depression. We're not talking about living in healthy rhythms and rest. Sloth is something different. And the phrase that I think best gets to the heart of it, in a way we can see the broader picture, is that sloth is a reluctance to take action. That's how I want you to think about it. A reluctance to take action. Now, granted, you may hear that at first and think, you know what, I'm just kind of putting some kinder pastor spin on being lazy. But that's really not what's happening here. Because whenever you assume someone is just being lazy, or even worse, call them lazy, in your shame and condemnation, what you're not doing is asking, why are they reluctant to take action? But many times what we say is, well, you know what? They're not taking any action because they're just lazy. And it's this illogical guilt loop that isn't helpful to anybody. And again, it's filled with shame. And more importantly, it's just not true. Rather, the much better question is, as a door turns on its hinges, why does the sluggard turn on its bed? Why are they reluctant to take action? And how does that show up in our lives? So, I want to take a few minutes and describe some of the ways that this sloth or reluctance shows up. And for some of you, it may feel like I'm describing how you feel pretty much moment by moment all the time. And for others of you, it may simply be particular moments or situations when you see this happening inside of you. And so my hope is, wherever you follow that spectrum, that together we'll be better alerted to this monster when it's happening. And again, not try to figure out how to run from it or try to destroy it, but rather, how do we best respond to it? So, one of the ways that sloth can show up in us is this: a reluctance to create conflict. Now, as we talked about the past couple weeks, each of these vices that we're discussing comes with a superpower of sorts, a way that some live in the world on a regular basis that is such a tremendous gift to the rest of us. And each of these vices is a corruption or a shadow side of that gift. And so when it comes to those where sloth is a main vice for you, it's typically because you have this superpower of being a natural peacemaker. You're often that person who can see both sides of a situation, and you have this beautiful ability to mediate between disagreements and understand where people are coming from and make them feel safe. But again, where that gets corrupted, whether that's naturally you or whether this just pops up on occasion for you, is in this reluctance to create conflict. And instead of helping make actual peace, what you end up settling for is the illusion of peace or the illusion of unity. It's this pretend kind of peace. Now, whenever I do counseling with couples, one of the things I often mention is that conflict is typically necessary and healthy for any relationship. The key is learning how to do conflict well. That's what we're often not taught how to do. But the couples I find myself most worried about are the ones who come in and are like, you know what, we never have any conflict. I mean, we never argue, we never disagree. And it's usually these couples that I'm getting ready to do like pre-marriage counseling with. And they're like, oh yeah, we never have any conflict. And the reason that always concerns me is because usually it means one of two things. Either one, you've got two people that aren't really in touch with what they actually want themselves. And they're not really passionate about anything really, even not really passionate about their relationship. Or two, what's more often the case is you have one person in the relationship who's just given up. They've essentially waved the white flag of surrender and decided, you know what, why am I even going to bother trying to express my opinion? Because the only thing this other person is going to do is just keep shutting it down and make me feel stupid for feeling that way, or talk in circles around me and treat me like I'm an idiot, make me feel like it's all my fault. And so the reality becomes, I just won't say anything, because at least then we can have some peace. But the thing is, that's not actually peace. And the reason we know that is because over time, what often starts to grow inside that person who has waved the white flag is the spirit of resentment and bitterness. And over time, those feelings can start to leak out in all these passive-aggressive kinds of ways. But you see, whenever we find ourselves reluctant to make any waves, reluctant to create any conflict, when the reality is something does need to be said, something does need to be done, something does need to be confronted, we find ourselves giving in to sloth. This reluctance to take action and using the keeping of this false peace to justify it. It's a way of approaching relationships and situations with this sense of, you know what, I'll just go along to get along. I'll just keep my head down and go along with whatever so we can all just get along. And we settle for this false sense of peace. And we end up fooling ourselves into thinking it's a good and healthy thing when deep down we know it's not. Now, another way to see sloth in ourselves and in others is in a reluctance to share one's opinion. Now, while this can get associated with not wanting to create conflict, often the motivation here is different. It comes down to this belief that others' opinions naturally are more important than yours. And we've all seen this play out on people or even ourselves, right? Where you're sitting in a meeting and you find yourself really not saying anything at all and you're reluctant to speak up, but it's not that you don't have opinions. It's not that you don't have anything to say. It's just your default assumption is that your opinion doesn't matter very much. And so taking the initiative to do so almost feels wrong because doing so carries with it simply the possibility of this threat of rocking the boat somehow. And that's the last thing you want to do. The last thing you want to do is insert yourself, draw attention to yourself, and rock the boat somehow. So instead, you just tend to keep to yourself. You just go along to make sure everyone can get along. And sometimes this may be you. Other times you see it in that person in the meeting or group who just tends to naturally get overlooked, where you've learned that they're probably not going to say anything unless you specifically ask for their insight. And the thing is, we all usually love to hang out with these people because they'll go wherever the conversation goes. They're not going to overtalk. They're not going to try to make everything about them. And it comes off as this really great humility. But sometimes what's really going on inside is this assumption that you really wouldn't be interested in anything they have to say. That's why they don't say something. That's the insecurity that's driving it. That sloth has corrupted this whole interaction and relationship dynamic. Where what's at the heart of it is this reluctance to initiate, to take action. And when that shows up in us, what we have to wake up to is that reluctance to take action is chiefly about our own fears of creating any type of friction. Because there are times when compassion and love and justice compel us to make waves. It compels us to share our opinions and to speak and to take action. It's waking up to the peace that we're trying so desperately to maintain often isn't actually peace. It's this false pseudo-pretend sense of peace where if we just sweep things under the rug and don't talk about it, eventually maybe it'll just all go away. You see, again, something that has the potential to be good gets easily corrupted. Now, here's another way sloth shows up. It's in this reluctance to fall short of perfection. Now, you may not have thought about it this way, but sometimes it can be our bias toward perfectionism that keeps us from actually taking action. Perhaps you find yourself pushing off doing something or letting something go or turning something in because in your mind, it's not perfect yet. And you have this impossibly high standard in your mind that actually keeps you from getting things done. You become scared it won't be perfect, and so you just end up avoiding it altogether. Others of us, what we do is we find ourselves waiting for the perfect time to do something that we know needs to get done. And that we start to believe somehow that the perfect moment will just magically present itself and everything else in our life will magically align in that moment to make sure that we have all the necessary space on our calendar and all the space in our lives, and that suddenly we have all the necessary motivation to accomplish a particular task in that perfect moment. But what we fail to wake up to is often that perfect moment never comes. And so we just keep pushing it off and pushing it off and turning in our bed like a door on its hinges, waiting around for this mythical perfect moment to show up. And in somewhat of the same way, sloth also can show up in this reluctance to take action unless there's a sense of crisis. Some of us, we get paralyzed in overanalyzing everything. And we struggle to figure out what to prioritize. And so we just keep avoiding things that need to get done and pushing them off until there's a crisis. Until it reaches the 11th hour, because the immediate sense of urgency then ends up prioritizing it for us. Or maybe this shows up in you or someone that you love where you've just labeled them as a procrastinator or lazy, but perhaps what's really at the root of that is they're scared. Scared of doing something wrong, scared of disappointing someone, scared of being overwhelmed and not knowing where to even start. And what ends up happening is we train ourselves and the people around us that we need some sort of crisis to take action. That if a parent or a loved one or a partner or a boss, if they want to motivate us to move or be helpful, if they want to get us to pay attention or to dive into a situation, then the implication is they need to create a sense of crisis first. They need to raise their voice. They need to show a lot of emotion. They need to come off as desperate. There needs to be some kind of threat to get us to act. And not surprisingly, when that version of sloth shows up, it ends up putting a lot of strain and stress on relationships. Because life just ends up revolving around one crisis to the next. Now let me offer two more ways this monster of sloth shows itself. Now this may seem very counterintuitive, but it also shows up in this reluctance to slow down. And this is another one of those unexpected ways sloth shows up in our lives, because we're constantly doing something and staying busy, and in our mind, that's the exact opposite of sloth. But in reality, what we're doing, some of us, is we're avoiding doing necessary internal work or relational work by disguising it with endless activity. So we can just go from activity to activity, keeping ourselves constantly busy and distracted as a way of avoiding the work of paying attention to our own souls. Avoiding paying attention to our own inner worlds or dealing with relational issues that we just keep sweeping under the rug and refuse to face. We're reluctant to take any action on what's actually most important because we just fill up our schedule with constant activity and we think, you know what, there's no way I struggle with sloth. I mean, look how much I'm doing all the time. When in reality, it can be the very vice, the very warning light on the dashboard that is flashing over and over again, trying to warn us that we have forgotten a much more important truth. To pay attention to the things that we actually know matter most. And then here's one more way sloth can show up. It's in this reluctance to face uncomfortable realities. Have you ever had one of those moments where maybe you keep putting off a doctor's appointment that you know you need to go to simply because you don't want to step on the scale when you get checked in and you don't want to be confronted with what the reality of that number is, and so you just keep putting it off? or you don't want to get confronted with the changes that the doctor may say that you need to make. Or you don't want the uncomfortable reality of facing the doctor knowing you've ignored what she advised you to do last time. So you just keep pushing it off. Maybe some of you are facing that with taxes this week because you just prefer not to face that reality till the very last moment. Sometimes the difficulty we most want to avoid, especially as men, is admitting that we don't know how to do something. And so rather than admit we don't know how to do something and take the risk of looking stupid to others or being an embarrassment or dealing with this feeling of incompetency, we just put things off, hoping they just go away over time. For others of us, we had visions of doing some real good in the world, tackling certain systems of toxicity and injustice and oppression. And you had all sorts of energy and passion, and you even linked arms with some other like-minded people. But when you challenged those systems of toxicity or oppression, whether they were religious systems or political systems or social or family systems, for some of you, those systems pushed back and pushed back hard. And suddenly, there were accusations, and there were unfair and untrue criticisms, there were rumors, there were attacks that left you discouraged and isolated and wondering if it was worth it, if it was just better to just throw in the towel. And perhaps what we need to be reminded of is that no one resists systems of injustice and oppression without those systems pushing back and resisting you. That's true of us as individuals, and that's true of us as a church community here at Crosspointe. And we need to be reminded of that. We can't expect things to be easy. We can't give into this reluctance to face uncomfortable realities. Rather, we have to embrace that most of what's worth doing will actually be hard and uncomfortable, and it will come at a cost. Things will go sideways along the way. It will require sacrifice. We will fall down, but we will also keep getting back up because Crosspointe, that's just how all the best stories always go. But here's something I want us to notice. As we consider all those reasons of why sloth can show up, one of the interesting things that is running in the background of all of them is fear. Fear of causing friction, fear of failing, fear of getting seen as incompetent, fear of confronting one's inner world or relational issues, fear of getting it wrong, fear of letting yourself get noticed and disappointing someone, fear of facing something uncomfortable. At the root of all of them is fear. And so when we embrace that fear is at the core of the issue here, it should prompt us to pay attention to how we treat other people in our lives who tend to be reluctant to take action or initiate things. The same people who we tend to accuse of being lazy. As we come back to all the time around here, Jesus says, here's what sums up the entire Bible. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Treat people the way you want to be treated. But often what our default attitude with people who struggle with sloth is, whether that's a spouse or a child or a coworker, anyone we have a relationship with, we look at them and say, sometimes to their face and sometimes behind their back, you know what, just quit being so lazy. I can't figure out why they're so lazy. And in doing so, we level these accusations at people and label them in our mind. And the way we try to confront the issue with our kids or our spouse or our employees is with this sense of shame and condemnation. But friends, listen, if we want to be a community of people marked by love and led by the Spirit of Christ, defaulting to simply labeling people as lazy doesn't get that done. We can love better than that. Rather, we need to ask ourselves, what does it look like to show compassion to this person's story? Compassion to their context. What does it look like to approach them with empathy rather than condemnation? Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that you don't ever address destructive patterns. But what empathy does is it prompts us to come alongside that person, to walk with them, to recognize that fear or trauma has injured them in some way, rather than just pointing fingers at them from this position of supposed moral superiority. And so we ask questions like, okay, knowing my friend or my coworker, knowing my son, knowing my daughter is afraid, knowing my husband or my wife is afraid, what does love look like here? How can I resist the urge to just condemn and seek to better understand? How can I actually be helpful in dealing with the thing they're most afraid of? And then this is key. being awake to that sometimes the thing our kids or spouse or employees is most afraid of is disappointing us. You and I. And so as a community trying to love people well, I think each of us have to have a responsibility in how we treat others who struggle with sloth. But I also want to wrap up our time today by trying to speak to how we can perhaps begin to gain some traction with it in our own lives when it shows up. And the reality is, I wish I had something that sounded more profound, but in trying to walk with people through all sorts of decisions the last 25 years, what I observe in people most often is that it simply boils down to someone deciding to do something they've been putting off or avoiding. I mean, when you listen to people's stories and you ask them, so what happened? What changed? What moved you from A to B? Nearly every time what you hear is, well, you know what? I just came to the point where I decided to take a step. I decided to stop waiting around and do something. I decided to have the conversation. I decided to finally just admit what had been going on. And in all of those situations, what you continually hear is, I decided. It's this virtue of decisive and right action. I decided. There's an author named Erwin McManus who wrote this years ago, and it's always stuck with me. He wrote this. He said, sometimes the most spiritual thing we do is choose. And so whenever and however the warning light of sloth shows itself, again, it's not something to get beat up by or to try to run from. Rather, it's an invitation to ask this question: what does right action look like in this moment? Because this is the virtue that counters sloth. It's right action. And here's the thing we have to remember. Right action can look like all sorts of things. Perhaps for you, right action looks like speaking up, being willing to risk some conflict because love and justice and legitimate peace are at stake. Or perhaps for you, right action looks like rest or maybe play because you've just been burning it in both ends of the candles all the time, and right action for you looks like rest. Or perhaps for you, it's making a hard phone call that you've been putting off for way too long. Or perhaps it's getting work or a task finished and getting it done now, because getting it done now blesses your coworkers or families, rather than to continuing just pushing it off with, you know what, I'll get to it later. Perhaps it's asking for help, where you refuse to let the fear of embarrassment keep you from taking any action. Perhaps it's admitting something that you've been hiding for a long time. Perhaps it's a willingness to face an uncomfortable reality rather than waiting around for a time when it's just supposed to get easy, when deep down, you know that's never going to happen. The perfect moment's never going to present itself. That when the warning light of sloth starts flashing on your dashboard, you simply ask, what does right action look like here in this moment? What does it look like to do the next right, wise, and loving thing in front of me? And not some false, corrupted version of those ideas muddied with fear and insecurity, but rather, what does the next right, wise, and loving action look like here in this moment, in this situation? And then have the courage to actually do it. And then, as you and I continue to love those for whom this is more of an innate wiring to how they approach life, may we be compelled to understand that suffering and fear are almost always at play here. That shameful criticizing is never helpful, but where we can help foster respectful environments that come alongside people, where we don't simply overlook them, but we intentionally ask for their opinions, where it maybe feels like someone always has to get a fire lit underneath them to get them to do anything, and perhaps we can try to lovingly offer help with structures or schedules, and we let that structure provide the fire that they need, not our condemning, harassing voice all the time. Or rather than letting them be frozen in the overwhelmedness, we can offer to help them maybe prioritize some tasks rather than just letting them drown because they don't know what to do next out of fear. And where we can encourage their injured hearts by acknowledging moments where we recognize they took right action rather than letting fear dominate. And we can say things to encourage their heart like, you know what, thanks so much for taking the initiative to do that. You know what, it needed to be done. It needed to be said, and you did it. Or you know what? It means a lot that of all the different things pulling on you, you made it a priority to finish this. And I want to say thank you. Or you know what? It's inspiring to see you being you, having your own convictions in the midst of so many other contrary ideas. I want you to know your voice matters. And I'm so thankful you put it in the mix. Friends, this is what it looks like to walk with one another in love. And so, here's continuing to wake up to these vices inside of us, where we see them not as monsters to run away from, but welcomed alerts that invite us into something better. And here's to growing in and being known as a people who don't cave into a constant pattern of reluctancy, but instead are always asking, what does the next right, wise, and loving action look like here? And then we have the courage to actually do it. Much love, Crosspointe. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspointe.org/help.